Utah real estate contracts are full of deadlines, and missing even just one could cost you your dream home or your earnest money. We're Rod and Melody, your guides to living in Salt Lake City and beyond. With over 30 years in Utah real estate, we're here to help you navigate this beautiful state with confidence. We make videos about living in Salt Lake, exploring the suburbs, and what life in Utah is really like. We've helped over 1,400 families make their move in, out, and around Utah. And whether you're headed to St. George, South Jordan, or Smithfield, we've got you covered. Hi, I'm Melody Moser, the principal broker at Moser Group. I've been in the real estate industry for 30 years, and I review real estate contracts every single day. Okay, let's break down the critical key deadlines that are listed in the Utah Real Estate Purchase Agreement. They would be the dates of the seller disclosure deadline, the due diligence deadline, the financing and appraisal deadline, and the settlement deadline. Even though the standard real estate purchase contract in Utah hasn't changed much over the years, just a little tiny bit, there are still some things that I see people, buyers, sellers, and agents misunderstanding or misinterpreting all the time. And that's what I want to cover today, is just to make sure that you know what you're getting into when you sign a real estate purchase contract in Utah. The first deadline that I want to talk about is the seller disclosure deadline. Before the property is actually listed and launched on the MLS, the seller should be filling out a 16-page seller disclosure form, gathering all the HOA documents, rental agreements, anything that they've gotten from the state or from the community that says, there's assessments looming. Anything that is a material fact of the property needs to be gathered before launch and then given to the buyer after they have signed a real estate purchase contract. The seller disclosure deadline that's put in the real estate purchase contract is simply getting the signature from the buyer that says, I have received the documents. That doesn't necessarily mean that the buyers had time to review everything and to process everything. It just simply means that they have received all that group of information that the seller is passing on to them about the material facts of the property. So first deadline, it's a signature from the buyer. Please don't miss that deadline because that can cause issues. Our second deadline is the due diligence deadline. Now remember, the buyer just received all of the disclosures, and now they've got a period where they can actually do due diligence. That would be inspections, reviewing all of that information. That is verifying anything in addition to the information that the seller gave them. Maybe they're going to call the city or the county or zoning or something like that. Who knows what the buyer wants to know about the property, but that due diligence period is for them to do all of those inspections. Now remember, the inspections are paid for by the buyer, but the seller is agreeing to open their home to all of the inspections. So the buyer might choose to do a radon inspection. The radon test is left at the house, and then several days later, it is picked up and read by the inspector. So sometimes those inspections seem a little bit intrusive, but they're necessary, and the seller already agrees to let the buyer perform those in the real estate purchase contract. So the seller disclosure deadline is a little bit unique because you have to have negotiated any of the repairs that you would like to request if you're the buyer. So this is how the seller disclosure deadline works with the inspection. The buyer does the inspection, comes up with a list of things that they would like to ask the seller to repair. Now, you don't have to if you're a buyer. You can just take the property in as-is condition. Let's say you're a handy person and you want to go ahead and just accept it. You're doing the inspection just to see what minor things need to do. That happens a lot. If you do end up needing to ask the seller to repair a few things, then you can ask the seller to repair them, but the seller does not have to repair them. If the seller says, no, I'm not going to repair any of them, then the buyer can walk away from the contract with their earnest money. That is the inspection deadline or the inspection contingency. Let's say the buyer asks for 5 items and the seller says, I want to do 4 of them, but I don't want to do number 5. Obviously, you can negotiate those and see if you can keep the contract together. So that's why you want to hire a really good real estate agent, somebody who's experienced in negotiating these contracts, somebody that looks at the contracts every single day like we do, that knows how to keep the transaction together even if there's some inspection issues. And we've seen it all over the last 30 years. There's very few inspection issues that we haven't seen and been able to negotiate between buyer and seller and keep the transaction together. Sometimes you can't, but most of the time we can. The next deadline is the financing and appraisal deadline. Now there's two things that have to go on for this deadline, and first off, it's the financing. So if the buyer does have financing involved, it all needs to be completed before this deadline. Now, completed doesn't necessarily mean that they need to be able to sign. It just means that the loan process or the loan needs to be at a point where the lender and the buyer are comfortable that it's going to go ahead and go through. That's the financing deadline. The appraisal deadline means that if it is marked as a contingency, the property has to appraise at or above the agreed sales price. So if it comes in below the agreed sales price, then the buyer and seller need to negotiate to come back to terms to go ahead and move forward. If you don't have a loan, then you don't have a financing deadline. If you don't have a loan and you have cash, you could ask for the appraisal, or maybe you don't need to ask for an appraisal. That's another reason that you want to hire a really good real estate agent, is to give you the advice to be able to choose which of the deadlines that you need to put into your contract and the length of time that you need in these contracts. So if you don't qualify for your loan, or if the house doesn't appraise, you do need to cancel the contract, get your earnest money back if you're the buyer before this financing and appraisal deadline. Okay, our next deadline is the settlement deadline. In the Utah real estate purchase contract, it's called settlement. And settlement and closing are two different things. Settlement happens when you go to the title company, you sign all of the closing documents, and closing happens from that day to 48 hours later, when all of the approvals have come in and the funds have been distributed back to the title company. So closing and settlement are different. You're gonna hear that those two terms interchanged. It's not correct, because settlement is signing, SS. Closing is 24 to 48 hours after you sign the documents. Typically on possession, I'm seeing most of the time in the contracts that the buyer is requesting upon closing that they get possession. That's what we're seeing in today's world. Sometimes you're negotiating that a little bit differently, but typically it's right then. You don't get your keys until closing. When you're making your plans to make your moves, then make sure that you're doing it not on the signing day, but on the actual closing day, which could be the same day, but not always. Want to keep your contracts on track? Use a dates and deadlines calendar to remind yourself when those deadlines are. Now at the Moser Group, we have a transaction coordinator, and her job is to make sure that we know exactly when those dates and deadlines are, and that we're following them so that the buyer does not lose their earnest money, and that the buyer stays involved in the contract if you're on the seller side. And that has saved more than a few dollars for our clients and kept more than a few deals together, because we've helped over 1,400 families move in, out, and around Utah. So whether you're moving to St. George, South Jordan, or Smithfield, we've got you covered. Now, if you want to learn more about the real estate industry and what's happening, watch the next video here.